We've been hearing about supply chain for a couple years now, and you hear about it in every conversation. In many of the conversations, many of the panels that we've been in for the past couple of days, we've also been hearing about supply chain. Matter of fact, one of them yesterday on port issues was focused on what we'll consider a somewhat narrow part of the supply chain, but today we're going to expand on it. And we're going to talk about some of the issues that companies encounter in a more holistic way. And if I'm correct, that in the next 60 minutes we will solve all of your global supply chain problems, making this the most valuable panel that you've encountered over the past 2 days. So in today's panel, we're going to address some of the larger concerns and issues out there. We've got a panel, and our first panelist will be Chris Denzel, Director of Government Affairs with DHL. We're also going to address some of the issues facing agricultural producers with Gert Oetvillian, who's Director of International Sales for Emerson Cargo Solutions, and also Jess Danker, who is the Vice President of Supply Chain at the Retail Industry Leaders Association. And we're going to detail or go over some of those issues that the retail environment faces. And I'm also going to talk at the end a little bit about some of the more specific granular points that could improve supply chains of the companies that, well, at least that I know of. So it's going to be a very informal panel. I would expect, if you have questions, raise your hand, stand up, and Randy from Boise, which is going to be a refrain from our conference, I suppose, will run over to you with the microphone. We'll move briskly over to you with the mic so that we can hear your questions. And we want to hear your questions because, again, I'm pretty informal, but we don't want to have a presentation and 20 minutes later you go, oh, you know, I had something that I was wondering about 20 minutes ago, and well, it just doesn't seem fitting to bring it up at this time. So we'll get the mic over to you, and we'll make sure that we're providing you with some clear thoughts and information. With that, we are going to launch right in, and I will introduce Chris, speaking from DHL on some of those general issues that we've encountered with the global supply chain.
Well, thanks so much for that, Sean. Always good to be introduced by my brother at Express Delivery. Supply chains. We always feel that way. Supply chains. Heard of them? Yes. We're having a moment with supply chains, right? We had them for the last 1.5, 2 years, right? It's certainly been the focal point of the pandemic and COVID, but obviously we're having challenges before the pandemic, right? And I think there's this misconception that it was the pandemic that really led to a lot of these challenges, which is certainly true, put a very fine point on it, but this was something that was occurring before the pandemic, right? And we had Russia and Ukraine, we have the baby formula incident, now we have continuing lockdowns in China. It's just a compounding set of issues that are creating, additional challenges, not only in the air environment, air freight environment, where I typically like to operate, or the truck environment, but certainly on the ocean and all of those. With COVID, obviously for us, responding to the challenge, obviously first and foremost was protecting our folks. Right? It was making sure that our folks on the front were protected. During the pandemic, certainly we did see a surge in volumes, right? This was largely because people were at home, you folks were at home, we were all at home, right? And we needed goods to be delivered to needed services. So we definitely saw a very sharp uptick, specifically as it related to e-commerce. And this, presented certainly a number of challenges, right? We had capacity, we had routes, we had to find workarounds. You combo that also with the port challenges, the container challenges, right? Because as we all know, not getting back to China during the pandemic, we had congestion, which I think is now down to 40 to 50 ships outside of the port. I think last time I checked, down from 60 or 70. I think we were hovering out there. So steady progress there. But we had a lot of folks that couldn't find available ocean freight, or ocean freight was priced out, so they needed deliveries, and that kind of certainly contributed to a lot of volume increase that we saw in the air. I think one thing, and I don't know if we're going to get to this, Sean, but I kind of like to highlight this, is kind of as I think through the supply chain question, obviously what comes next, I think a lot about the government. And I think, and this may just be because I'm stationed here, but I think a lot about what is the USG, what are our partners going to do so far as it relates to supply chains, think about things like mandates, reshoring incentives, what have you. I think that's going to drive a lot of what companies think, right? Because companies certainly are continually reevaluate their supply chains, their suppliers, their inputs, and that obviously is going to continue, right, rethinking about where things are placed, where we're sourced from. the government might contribute on.
Well, I have to ask, how many of you are involved at all in container imports in the United States? Okay, so not a lot. So you guys are all pure exporters, no procurement or anything like that, because that has become a mess. And when you talk about governmental systems, I think if we look at, let's say, you know, the large elephant, of course, is China, and sourcing from China, which, of course, if you're an importer or if you're an exporter, chances are you have a component of that is import. And right now, and this is something everybody's experiencing, container rates are up 5 times, air freight is up maybe 2 or 3 times, and that's only a portion of it. And you can pay your way out of a lot of problems, but on top of that, you have delays. Right now, if you want to get an ocean container out of China, if you recall, you're not going to get that container for 2 or 3 weeks. If you want air freight, you're not going to get it for a week. So on top of that, you've got those delays. And where I'm going with that is when you talk about governmental issues and nearshoring, I have to mention, I'm from Texas. So what's good for Mexico is good for Texas. And I think we might have a lot of companies rethinking their supply chains and bringing, let's say, materials in from more reliable sources. We're on the same time zone, more cultural affinity, and on top of that, if I need to be in Mexico and Maquiladora on the border, I can be there tonight. So it's short of a border crossing, it's a reliable supply chain. And I think when you talk about that nearshoring, that's an important issue. I think a lot of companies are reassessing their exposure to China, and if not China, long supply chains that originate in Asia.
And I guess the other thing I think about, I guess when it comes to export, the government is certainly sort of restrictions, right, or trade barriers, right? We saw this definitely during the pandemic with restrictions on pharmaceutical ingredients, their export, PPE, their export, for example. Now, obviously, we certainly advocate for those to exist and come down, and I think we're seeing a trend that way. But I would say, when it comes to the government-to-government conversation, on the export front, certainly things that we advocate for greater trade facilitation, paperless trade needs of the customs, what have you, to make it easier, specifically for SMEs that don't have large customs compliance departments, to make sure that they're able to export to new markets or existing markets that they want to. So let me stop there, because I know we got some more.
Well, let's start. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Oh, sure, you're all full of supply chain questions and comments. When we're not asking for your input, but now that we ask for it, okay.
Okay, there.
Oh, thank you, so kind. Comment first. So I'm an importer and an exporter. So first time this hit us was about 2 years ago when a company on the East Coast, or West Coast, in Southern California, and they said that we have this little box that we put all of our instruments in, and our Chinese supplier is now gone. They had no clue what to do. It took us 2 months to research that. The answer was not what they wanted to hear. It turned out for this particular item, the only country in the world that makes it is China. I mention that because I know we all, for all of our reasons that are very, real, want to disengage from China. However, in the supply chain network, we do need to be aware, and you need to be aware, that you cannot automatically replace something. You've got to either research it yourself or find somebody out there that can research it for you so you know what your alternatives really are. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that I really wanted to ask this question in the Latin America thing about what's going on with the transportation system in Mexico. Because there is no question, and a good friend of mine is an FDI specialist, and he is flooded now with companies coming from Europe, relocating, by the way, not only to America, Canada, and Mexico. There's no reason to believe that flood's going to stop. And now the issue becomes, with the supply chain, Mexico, like many other countries, there are some things they can produce, but there are many other things that they cannot produce. So it just would appear to me that this is a global, long-term supply chain restructuring issue. What do you think about that?
All right, well, I think it's going on, right? We see it in different forums, right? The US and EU just completed another round of these conversations, this Trade and Tech Council, right, where supply chains are running around the world. Later this month, actually, so in the coming days, President Biden's going to announce the the Indo-Pacific framework with who knows, 7 to 9, 7 to 12 countries. There, the supply chains once again are a focal point of all those efforts, right? I think when it comes to Canada and Mexico, probably the renegotiation of NAFTA, USMCA had something to do with that, but then also the focus has been placed on as Sean pointed out, shortening the supply chains, making it closer to home, right? Because of the disruptions that folks witnessed during the pandemic, the cost of fuel, the cost of ocean freight, what have you. Just looking for different, not only diversified supply chains, but resilient supply chains that can withstand future shocks. It's going to be interesting to see what materializes from these government-to-government conversations with Europe, with the Indo-Pacific partners, with ASEAN and others. When it comes to supply chains, like, is it going to be, perhaps targeted on certain sectors, semiconductors, semiconductor raw inputs, or is it going to be broader to include other critical materials, other critical products? Could it include food, right? I mean, think about what's going on coming out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine with wheat and other food commodities. We have some smart thoughts on it coming up later here, but those conversations are happening, and I think one thing that talking with colleagues and companies, not only do they have to do their, as I mentioned, their internal reviews, right, their supply chains, but also what does the future policy environment look like, and how is that going to shape their thinking when it comes to CapEx decisions, when it comes to relocating supply chains, when it comes to what type of modes do we want to have access to.
Yeah, sure. And just by way of background, I'm, as was already said, I'm with the Retail Industry Leaders Association. We're a trade association for the largest retailers in the country, so our members are intentionally in that kind of higher band of retail companies with sales of over $1 billion, accounting for several hundreds of thousands of facilities and millions of employees, usually with at least a North American footprint, but often with operations around the world and certainly sourcing on a global footprint as well. So I think definitely in looking at kind of that nearshoring conversation, definitely something that's been going on with retailers even prior to the pandemic, looking at it's a continual conversation around that sourcing strategy. And even prior to the China tariffs of the previous administration, it's this ongoing conversation. But to the point that you can't just flip a switch and pull out of countries or find substitutes for things that you might have sourced. An example that one of our members gives around handbags. You can get handbags from a lot of countries, but the kind of very detailed beadwork or sewing work may only be possible to find in China because they have a more developed and kind of tenured production process there. But it is an ongoing conversation for sure, and I think what you're seeing is this progression, particularly as China continuing to be challenging with production shutdowns and the zero COVID policy, maybe accelerating for some retailers that conversation around looking at diversifying that sourcing strategy, moving further away from that, looking in other regions, definitely to include Central America and South America, getting a bit closer to the U.S. shores for all the reasons that have been touched on. Supply chain, certainly not least among those. And I think the more you see the kind of critical mass of, in our case, large retailers, but also other businesses making those moves to whether it's South America or shifting more of that production to or back to Mexico, that you will see development of. I mean, you mentioned the transportation networks and the effect there. As you see those critical mass of companies moving back to those areas, that kind of rising tide of swell of that business coming back increases their infrastructure and build up the accessibility from a transportation standpoint.
Great. We have another question. Oh, Ernesto.
Ernesto Pino from the Idaho Tech. I would like to add that small companies and medium-sized companies, for the first time, are confronting one issue that I think has been mentioned, but I see some of my clients that before, calculating the cost of shipping or delivering the products or the time that it will take wasn't an issue. It was more about production, supply of material, blah, blah. Not to say that there are no issues on that, but that has become a major problem for medium-sized and small companies. They can't predict when are they going to be able to deliver. They cannot make commitments to their clients. And that, of course, erodes part of the customer service, customer reputation. And in addition, the cost. What cost should I put? And they have to guess. And if they guess right, that's fine. But if they get wrong, either they lose money or they might actually be overpriced, and then they lose the opportunity. Now, in regards to the decentralization from China, what I would like to add is that the Canadian and the American governments had started this process since 3 years ago, and then they invited the Mexican counterpart, and it's being done by sector. So the first one was the strategic, that it's called the Strategic Minerals Supply Agreement, and they have been working on that kind of on the background in silence, but it's very important because it's what is needed to really secure technology and the economies of the future. So there are conversations on that, and also medical is the other one, and communications is the other one. And those might require, and the governments are willing to do that. If they need to subsidize initially this process, they are willing to do it because they know that that's the equivalent of creating the railroad. And once you have the tracks, then you can actually move more wagons into it or other industries. In a way, it's resembling or replicating what was done by the private industry in the automobile and the aerospace industries. But it's going to take time. Now, the other problem that I often see is that the business community got so used to dealing with China that they started seeing that as a black box. I call it the black box effect. And the closest to that is a vending machine. Where you go, you insert a coin or a couple of coins, you press a button, and you get your drink or chocolate or whatever it is. And you don't care what goes on there, who supplies that, who pays for electricity, who maintains the machine. I don't care. I just want to put my money, push a button, and I want my product. And China performed that task very well for so many years. And nobody cared about what goes on in the black box. I don't care. I just want my product, and I get it. Now, until COVID hit, well, first the tariffs that were imposed started forcing those business community to question about is this the best way, but in a soft way. Then when COVID hit, that's really eye-opening because they finally, and I say finally because I'm very grateful that happened, they started really questioning, well, why do I continue operating on that black box where I don't know and I have no control of what goes on? And because of that, I think somebody was already pointing out the fact that there are a lot of things that you cannot find anywhere except China. But little by little, those components start, and actually those, what I call the law, and I was just reading an article in that, and I have the name for anybody that wants it, that there has been a migration of companies, what I call low-value companies, out of China, some to Vietnam, and some also to the Americas.
Well, Ernesto, if we could stop there, because you've got like 5 different major topics you touched on.
All right.
And I think we can all agree that just-in-time works great when just-in-time works. And many companies did get very used to that. And China became the easy go-to location. And quite frankly, back to this side over here, and it's funny because I teach international global supply chain management. And this has all been an exercise in people ignoring everything that they learned when they were studying global supply chain management, which is diversification, agile supply chains, and having backup suppliers. And okay, we like it easy, everybody likes it easy, and that's what too many companies have done, is they relied on a system that works when it works, but it doesn't when it doesn't. And they had no backup because the guy that's going, well, wait, we're getting this at this price and this time. Well, let's start looking at other ways we might do this. Everybody's going, we don't want to do that. This is too easy. It's too profitable. And these companies, sadly to say, a majority of companies set themselves up because they had no backup plan.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point around kind of that black box nature of China in particular. And Chris and I were just talking about Forced Labor Prevention Act and some of the potentially the unsavory things that may be happening in China and other problematic practices on that side, both from a country level as well as some of the individual suppliers. And I think as you see, certainly our members see just the tremendous importance of ESG matters and the weight of that from a consumer perspective, but also from just company and brand importance and kind of their strategic imperatives and how they want to be in terms of corporate citizens. So I think that drives a bit of certainly drives a lot of the kind of conversation around that diversifying. There's the business piece, whether it's supply chain and the diversification imperative, but also looking at assessing potential sources, both from again the country level or from individual companies, looking at what that individual with the ESG perspective as well, and using that as a metric to determine those choices in addition.
So just let's hear more about retail.
Okay. Well, I think, when we were talking before chatting as well, certainly retail is pretty significantly importer-driven in the U.S. But I think that there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of the experiences that exporters have been having in terms of the supply chain challenges, but also in terms of the things that are relevant and important in terms of looking ahead and some of those imperatives. I don't need to, I think, rehash the last 2 and change years of the kind of supply chain disruption that we've been seeing. I mean, you talked as well about these kind of soaring costs and uncertainty around timing. Retailers have also experienced this, and I know you were kind of speaking from the lens of small and medium-sized companies. Here, our members, as I said, are the largest companies in many cases in the world, and they are also experiencing the same sort of soaring costs, uncertainty. Looking at ocean carriers, the lowest schedule reliability since they've began keeping track of these sorts of things. Soaring costs from the standpoint of the kind of published rates on ocean, but also accessorials. In addition to that, amounting to cost to move a container trans-Pacific, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200% higher than pre-pandemic. So just looking at those huge costs, and that's even just looking, in the ocean shipping picture, not even to touch on domestically looking at the truck market, constrained capacity, market demand index up in the neighborhood of 700% higher than pre-pandemic times. All of these things kind of taken together, labor constraints, capacity issues, production issues on the abroad. Looking at that kind of those kind of constraints and that level of disruption, and to think that it's affecting the largest shippers in the world. I mean, you look at some of the large retailers who have felt compelled to charter their own ocean ships, entire ships, because they don't have the ability to work with the ocean carriers to get the kind of reliability in terms of schedule and certainly the rates and that sort of thing. So probably likely a lot of the same disruptions that exporters have been seeing. It's really two sides of the same coin, just in the opposite direction, what the retailers have been experiencing as well. So when looking at kind of some of the things that retailers have been doing to mitigate a lot of that disruption, definitely kind of reevaluating their networks, looking at the role of kind of nodes, how are stores used, how are their distribution centers, fulfillment centers used, what ports are they using, again, going back to the sourcing conversation, looking at their sourcing strategy and revisiting that diversification standpoint there. A lot of, I think, collaboration with certainly domestic and motor carriers in terms of accessing that capacity, and also different approaches in terms of contract issues. A lot of the, we've kind of just gotten through contract season on the ocean side. We've seen a lot, longer contracts that the shippers have been locked into versus previous times, looking to lock in those rates and mitigate some of that uncertainty. But I think also that network design piece has been a really key aspect coming out of what we've seen with our members, and then also that different approach to inventory. To your point around just in time and lean was kind of the MO for most companies over the past however many years, and really seeing a switch to more of a buffer approach or just in case inventory. I think that retail inventory to sales ratios were at one point last year at the lowest point that they had ever been, I think, in the last 50 years. And looking at now, I think the last measurement I looked at in March, they're up 22% over pre-pandemic levels. So just really building up that inventory piece. And that kind of changes the entire conversation around the movement of freight. Do you have a question?
We've got a question over here.
Oh, Senator.
Thank you. What is the outlook for the container crisis?
Well, I don't think that you're going to see any noticeable improvements anytime soon. I think we'll be seeing challenges on the ocean shipping front. As Chris said, we see it's marginal improvements in terms of the ships that are waiting, but also it's a piece of how are they measuring that? We've seen they're just parking the ships or slow steaming outside of where they can be seen in news reports. You'll continue to see, I think, a lot of disruption. Rates aren't going down. They're certainly not going down to pre-pandemic levels. At any time in the near future, if ever. They'll continue to stay elevated. Still seeing congestion, and then of course, I think we're all aware that the West Coast port labor negotiations which started last week. Everybody's on pins and needles watching how that's going to go. Not a lot of optimism, at least from a lot of quarters, given that the PMA, the employer side, offered a contract extension back in, I think it was November, and the ILWU kind of, with great haste, rejected that. So that I think can continue. And you've already seen, I mean, I can't speak to the exporter side, but certainly among our members and on the import side, our members have already been, working on mitigation tactics for that, just anticipating, slowdowns. Even though we haven't really been seeing the slowdowns yet on the West Coast, related to that, but anticipating that it's not going to get any better before July 1st, already affecting kind of where, movement of the Gulf and East Coast ports. So yeah, not to rain a lot of sunshine on the room, but I don't see things dramatically improving. But I think the good news is that users of freight and shippers, exporters and importers have been doing this for so long that they've kind of built into their planning a way to both, use the data and have a bit of historical knowledge now after two and a half years, where they have a bit of sense of what they need to do to plan for this, and a bit of more of a playbook than in the earlier days, so that there is more ability to mitigate that. But even though we've seen backing up on congestion a little bit, it's kind of squeezing the balloon. Does it just go to the East Coast, and that sort of thing. So not back to normal yet, but I think people moving freight have more of a playbook to lean on for keeping things moving.
I'm in that group of people looking to get containers to export. And the question, we would actually like a bit of a recession so we could get containers. But the question I have for you is with the big retailers. Both Target and Walmart stock just tanked, like over 20%. Now, is that because they have too much inventory now, or because the prospects look bad for the future? Now, and I hope there's too much inventory, so they quit turning these containers around like that.
Yeah, well, certainly, it's challenging. I think a lot of you were in the inventory or the earnings announcement season, so you've seen a lot of people kind of missing, a lot of companies missing targets, and many of the companies, the two you mentioned, but several others as well, pointing to those high supply chain costs as being a driver of part of that. You're continuing to see kind of strong consumer demand, even in spite of a lot of the inflationary pressures. So the top line, we know of those companies, it's strong. It's just the costs underneath that are taking a bigger bite out of that, and there's not a ton of margin to do that. But I think it's I don't think it's necessarily as much around the inventory, because I think they're looking at that. But from the conversations we've had with the financial analysts and retail analysts, that's not really the picture they're kind of looking at it. But it's more around that long term. I think we're getting to a structural point at this point where we're looking at these supply chain costs, not anticipating those to recede in the near future. So that's causing a challenge, and I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the earnings announcements and some of the challenges that they're going through right now with the earnings announcements.
I've got a quick question.
Oh, sorry.
All of us have heard, the various issues.
Is that all? That's fine.
Yeah. Issues surrounding the problem of the supply chain. And I'm curious from each of your perspectives, what are the countermeasures that your organizations are putting in place to try to be able to improve the situation, whether it's incremental or substantial? Are you getting airplanes that are taking the seats out and trying to make those cargo jets? Are you trying to get cargo ships that are totally empty coming back from Asia over here to try to mitigate these issues? I'm curious about what countermeasures you're looking at.
I'm going to start from the air side. Yeah, no, so we actually have a big portion of having new aircraft come into our network throughout the course of the pandemic, right? We exercised a few contracts. We also found some new partnerships, right, with non-cargo carriers to carry some freight as well. But it really was, how can we just add capacity, right? How do we get, and obviously we have the same challenges as everyone else in the labor front, finding enough folks to work, but how do we add more routes? How do we have more capacity? How do we get more flights out the door? How do we keep that going? Not only during the pandemic, we have restrictions on flight hours, so we can test all that stuff, but now it is how do we have more routes, what routes make sense, and it really is responding to what's happening at the global sphere, right? With the blackout of China, what we need to do to accommodate in, if you go back to the balloon, squeeze it here, where's it going to come out? And it really is about adding that capacity. And we're different. We're in the logistics network as opposed to the production or retail or manufacturer. So it really was how can we get more capacity, how can we respond, in this very uncertain time, but I think kind of looking over the horizon to the questions about what's going to happen, with the future of ocean, or those problems don't seem anytime soon. So I think it really does speak for the increasing importance of the we have.
I would also make a point too that one thing that has been mentioned that helps with capacity is the underbelly of passenger flights, and that's come back on, and that's also been changing. So just a point to reference.
Yeah, as those passenger flights come back online,
yes,
we've lost a lot, especially from the intercontinental.
Sean, do you want to keep on questions, or do you have something?
No, matter of fact, we're going to go. You guys have comments on that?
Yeah, and I could be pretty quick on that. I know I talked about a couple of the mitigation tactics in terms of certainly kind of near term, a lot of rerouting, diversifying on ports, and kind of avoid that congestion. You can really creative sorts of things that you wouldn't think. The shortest distance between A and B to not be a straight line, where it's creative zigzagging through where you're trying to get to Chicago with rails out, so you have to go through Dallas, and a lot of that kind of supply chain ninja work in those kind of near term, putting out fires. But then looking at kind of medium term, again, it's looking at the networks and how do retailers need to kind of realign those networks for this kind of new normal, if you will, or really to be more agile and responsive for whatever the particular future holds, not really knowing. But then I think long term or longer term, looking at, and something where RELA works with our members on, is looking at infrastructure investments and addressing some of the systemic challenges, certainly in ports. And I think that goes to your point around the container availability and that equipment dislocation piece. I think part of that is due to just the lack of visibility, certainly, but also some of those systemic challenges in the ports in terms of the return of empties and having a bunch of empty containers and chassis as well sitting out on the street, where they can't be returned because of restrictions on appointment times and some of the things that could be addressed from that standpoint. But also as well looking at the investment picture, certainly from the ports, but also other links in the domestic infrastructure as well. And I think a piece that is a big focus for our members and for us is around data visibility, the end-to-end visibility and interoperable data standards for that sharing, so that it isn't so much of so that there isn't so much of a black box, and you're able to know not just where things are, but also to be able to act on where things are going to be. And I think that data piece is just huge. I mean, when you look at it, you can order a pizza, and I know when they're putting the pizza into the oven, but you don't know where your container is on the ocean. There's a real opportunity for that, and that's something that has got the attention of the administration. Certainly, I think everyone had seen the announcement around their Flow project. We're working also with our members as part of a private sector-led coalition driving development of those data standards for interoperability. But I think that you see a couple of other initiatives all kind of be cohesive around that. That's a big piece around how we kind of long-term address some of these issues and get to that point from a not just retail industry standpoint, but the whole supply chain as well, and something I think will be critical going forward.
Yeah, talking about the supply chain, I'll talk about my talk because the reason I came here, as well as when we approached the Idaho legislators, is really talk about U.S. agriculture exporters. We sell technology in the ag sector, and the U.S. exports, we talk about your numbers, right? Part of that increase in exports is not being able to get agriculture product. And it's an export out of the United States. It's a big problem because it's perishable. There's expiration date, the time it comes from the tree, the time it's butchered, right? So if you can get it out, sometimes it's a delay of a year. It's not sitting in a port somewhere. It's been costing a fortune. But out of curiosity, Captain Peter, does that ring a bell for anybody in the room?
Yes.
Yes. Why? And what is it?
Isn't he the guy who was the captain of the MSC vessel in Philadelphia?
That could have been as well too. However, Captain Peter is the MERS software platform that provides visibility and transparency in refrigerated sea containers. before the pandemic and currently at Pasadena. If you have a refrigerated shipment of American Captain Peter, you know the status, you know the temperature, you know how to fuel, any possible maintenance as well. So when we talk about technology, it is available. Actually, I work for a company that has a technology platform that could help this industry. And actually, we have helped some members. But what Sean told me is that supply chain is doing well. Our offices have been bombarded because we make a technology product in Idaho, and all of the other places in the world, that monitors time and temperature. And on a perishable shipment, it is critical. So have I been hurting as much when China stopped buying US cherries in the beginning? No, because I've sold the same technology. We export or return, stealing, right? US exports dollars. But it's at least a lot of these technologies somewhere else. So when I got asked by Sean and say, tell me about this, it's a real big problem right now, especially for my customers, the agriculture industry. They're losing billions of dollars. Now, what has gone well is the steam miners have shown up. Right before the pandemic started, it was the biggest produce show in the world, and all the steam miners were there, promoting their most advanced technology. Because pre-COVID, these refrigerated or frozen or controlled atmosphere containers were their premium customers. They would save space on the ships because they got a lot more money. They could make a lot more dollars of this. So what I've seen, those same salespeople in those big organizations who were again 2 weeks ago at the show in Berlin, they are still there. So I would challenge anybody, if you don't know how to get into Maersk, start calling their refrigerated division because they share the same problem. They're fighting for space on these vessels for their customers. However, what has gone well? 2 years during COVID, those companies made more profit than the previous 20 years. So what does that mean? And we've seen reports, they're investing and they're buying stuff. So they're investing in their refrigerated fleet. They're investing in their capacity as well too. But at the earlier point, then you get to build the capacity in the system as well too. Because if 2 extra Maersk sea container ships, the whole 15,000, can't find the spots on the loader of the capacity in the US system, it's gonna be problematic, right? You need that in the supply chain inland. So as a Dutch trader or a US exporter, you know, for a living, right? That's what I've seen in Europe as well too. You gotta keep all these parts together involved. Now, that doesn't fix the problem overnight. So what have we done with the Idaho deck? And I called the Idaho Agriculture Department, who was also a member on our Idaho deck, and I said, what does it mean for dollars? And he said, do you think, you know, this potato grower or this dairy producer or this beef rancher has time to start calling these container companies? No. What has gone well is California. The 2 senators from California have done this. They wrote a letter to all their container plants and put some dollars on it. $1.5 billion, I heard the number earlier this week, alone in agricultural products. They're looking for over 30,000 containers that can handle walnuts and pistachios and everything else. So before this summer, right, that's the big issue. And those items have a shelf life. So the same thing with dairy industry. Dairy plus, we heard it earlier as well too. So what do we think we can help solve this? And the thing is to be a bigger voice together, right? Talk to your local ag agency. Now, Idaho is big in agriculture exports, heavily focused also in Asia, but also in Canada and Mexico. Yet at the same time, right, you can't ask the exporter in the U.S. to change strategies, right? They've invested sometimes years to get market access, but you can't just shift over, you know, to Europe or the Middle East or South America as well too. So I think this is we, as you know, an export group. I think that's what we did earlier this week. You got to reach out locally and, you know, be a voice for that small exporter, right? They might not pick up the phone, they might never read the letters, but maybe also ask your local ag department or your commerce department to be a voice for the small, medium-sized businesses. I think the other part, what we have learned in the supply chain stuff, is serving our customers is we got to diversify, right? We always have 2 warehouses in the US, right? And then we're however, what we've learned is, you know, first of all, on the supplier side, we vetted those suppliers. It's a bad strategy to rely your whole business on one supplier. Now, we have one supplier in Idaho, but we also, you know, are part of their success as well, too. So we know we can trust them. But the same thing with our warehouse. We have now a warehouse in Europe. Why? Still, shipping is bulk over there. It's typically to negotiate a better price and the price goes down. The same thing in Asia. We have a warehouse in Asia, right? So any disruption in the supply chain, at least you can build a buffer. Now, sometimes as a small exporter, you might not have that, but on another business that I'm directly involved in, we started negotiating with some of our key and some of our best distributors, and guess what? They were had a vested interest, and you know, you could make a little bit of money together with us by storing some items that locally you can ship overnight to, you know, the neighboring country or within the region too. So if you haven't thought about that, I would recommend it. Then the last part is really technology. If you need to know where your container is, there is technology out there. And compared to the increase in rate, it's a small premium to pay, and it's really data driven. We're not going to promise anything with this technology that things are going to go faster, but I think you can start making better data driven decisions. We've seen this before the pandemic with our agriculture exporters. We could tell them, based on the behavior, who has the best refrigerated equipment in the industry, who has the best on-time delivery as well too. I think it's the same thing what Amazon did, I think, really well, is they started automating the data-driven solution, right? We are doing the same thing as well. So now, of course, now the products we have in the portfolio as well, some of our suppliers, they need to go from 60 days to 110 days, but we adjust to this as well too. So I can solve the industry's problem as well too. I would encourage anybody exporting to just keep investing. You know, see if you have one supplier or multiple suppliers, right? And how trustworthy are they? You know, regionalize some of your inventory if possible. That would help your local customers outside the US for quicker delivery. And the other part is really keep on looking at technology solutions that automate some of this, that drive data decisions, and you know, ensure you still get most of your product or a bigger part of your product. And then as last I said, you know, don't be afraid to speak for your local tech members as well too, to your senators, to your legislators, or even to your governor and saying, hey, we're losing American exports, you know. Help us create a force in those big companies that these small people
We have a question here and one question.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. I wanted to second Ernesto's first part of his comment, which was related to SMEs and delivery time guarantees. I'm from Puerto Rico, I represent the Puerto Rico deck, and the situation that we have in Puerto Rico is that our exporters are mostly new generation exporters. That means that many of them are starting, so they still don't feel containers, so they have to go airborne. And that means that they have to get into a contract with a shipping company or to get discounts on their shipping. But then when the pandemic came and the logistics problems started out, the delivery times were not being met. But because of the contracts that we were filing with the shipping companies, we were getting stuck with having to pay for shipments that did not meet the delivery times or even got lost in the way and they never get them. So my question is, are you willing to revisit those contracts, those commercial contracts with these exporters, having this post-pandemic situation that's very different from the time that those contracts were, by the time they were designed, maybe this was a pre-pandemic situation that did not foresee the situations that we're having now. So are you planning to renegotiate with those SMEs that want to export, but then get into these situations and then they get scared and they go like, okay, I don't want to export because this is what happened to me when I started exporting. I got stuck with this contract, I lost the shipments, and now I don't know if this is going to keep happening. I don't know. Do you have something else?
Yeah, I don't.
Contracts with previous conditions and now they are not valid, but paying the same price at the same period.
Yeah. What happens
Or
is,
even more.
if you were engaged in a contract with a carrier, of course, the pandemic threw everything off. And based on the tariff of every carrier that's out there, based on emergency conditions and that kind of thing, it waives a lot of the conditions of those contracts. A lot of the carriers did put in, let's say, locks that would carry you over through the worst of the pandemic. Most of those are gone. So you can always go back and renegotiate with the carrier. And for the most part, guarantees are back in place. But it's still subject to what's going on. As an example, I get these calls all the time. Somebody's got something that's been sitting in Shanghai for 4 days and they can't get it out. I'm sorry, Shanghai's been shut down for 7 days. There's absolutely nothing I can do about it. When it comes to Europe, you're exporting things to Europe. When we talked about reallocation of resources, all those planes that were flying to Europe were doing great. When there was that big glut, or not a glut, let's say everything was locked up in Asia, well, what's a carrier going to do? The carrier's going to relocate some of those assets to Asia to help relieve the burden there. You know what happened then? Now suddenly there are problems in Europe. And for a carrier, it just doesn't make sense to try to increase all the assets. It's just not possible to do for those short-term conditions. We see this every year at Christmas here in the United States. A carrier's not going to buy 100 planes and 20,000 trucks that are going to sit idle for 3/4 of the year. So as unfortunate as it is, there are still delays. And really without making business decisions that just aren't long-term sustainable, we're all going to have delays. And it hurts us. Well, I won't say as much as it hurts you, but it does hurt us substantially in that we don't make, every carrier out there doesn't make a lot of commitments now because of events that are outside of our control.
So there's a way to get to a happy medium maybe with the SMEs and shipping companies.
Exactly. Even as an SME. Excuse me. Gert said, have a relationship as a group, work with your governments and that kind of thing. As well as an SME, and this is going to sound terrible for me coming from a provider, but have a relationship with your provider. I don't care if it's UPS, whoever that provider is, because during the pandemic, I had a company a day at least coming to me saying, I've got a new line of business, I want great discounts and I want you to ship something out of China for me tomorrow. Sorry, it's not going to happen. And yesterday, during the board discussion, they were talking about how people could not get a hold of their sales reps. And there was a reason for that. The sales rep can do absolutely nothing for you based on the conditions. But if you have a relationship with a carrier, and if you have involved them, and you're paying them, you might as well involve them in the design of your supply chain. Otherwise, you've got a transactional relationship. Nobody really likes that. Work with them, have them make recommendations, because I can guarantee you, as a person that works with customers that are having these supply chain problems, if I know you, if we've talked, we've interacted.
And understand their supply chain.
Right, you're gonna get a lot more out of me than somebody that comes to me out of the blue. Okay, and this happened a month ago. I want to charter a 747 out of China once a week. Where to? Anywhere in the United States you get it. I'm sorry, that's not a relationship. That's never gonna happen. And just like a lot of those court, let's say those ghostings that took place in the court panel yesterday, I have a job. I don't have time for that when people are jumping around just trying to find a new carrier. So when the pandemic happened, if you had a relationship with a carrier, chances are you got much better service than those people that always had that arm's length relationship with their carrier, their provider, their consultant, whoever, freight forwarder, whoever it's going to be, and then decided, I've got a problem. Now suddenly I need somebody to take care of it. If I don't know you, you're out of luck. Because I had a lot of people that had problems that I knew that I understood what they were trying to accomplish and I could help them. If you come to me and say, let's start a relationship, sorry, I just can't do it. I just do not have the bandwidth, or the organization can't turn on a dime on that.
If I can also just like, and this isn't pertaining to air freight, but and the ocean shipping, scene, working with the Federal Maritime Commission, and particularly some of you may be familiar with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. It's currently, well, it's been passed by the House a couple of times, the Senate passed it now in the China Competes bill. But that does include, additional protections for shippers, again, specifically looking at ocean shipping, shipper protections on that, and protection against retaliation, and some of the things that have been a challenge. And also, looking specifically at the export piece of encouragements, let's say, or guarantees around access to capacity on ocean ships.
Like Sean mentioned about short-term versus long-term, and I like that building relationship with the carrier before the pandemic happens, before a disaster happens. So the question, what I'm hearing really, the failure of the supply chain is they didn't have long-term thinking, they violated everything you teach. There wasn't agility, no redundancies, no backup plans, nothing. Now, for the past few months, I'm reading articles about the Great Resignation. I'm reading articles about baby boomers retiring at least 10,000 a day, every day. I'm reading about, really, I was talking to an airline pilot that says there is a shortage of pilots. That's part of the supply chain. I have clients who are in the trucking business, there is a shortage of truckers. That's part of the supply chain. Are we just reacting, or are we now concurrently reacting, responding, and proactively thinking about the future? So my question is, what is the effect of the Great Resignation, on the supply chain? What is the effect of the retirement of the baby boomers with all the institutional knowledge and the skills of the supply chain, and the lack of truckers and the lack of lines, et cetera, et cetera?
You would take that?
Yeah, so part of our customer base is US based because they buy from all of the US to big supermarkets, and so trucker shortage became an issue. I think the US responded well by changing some of these regulations, by allowing extra overtime and also changing regulations for people to enter into the system. At the same time, a truck that originates in Mexico got to offload at the border before they got over there. So I think there's certainly improvements as well too, where you just got to have a certain amount of drivers. At the same time, it speeds up also, I think, other ways to transport. What I've seen before is longer trucks, right? In Europe, they had an issue with driver availability as well too. I think innovation is a strength and resilience is, and I think we got to take a look at it as well too. Be more open-minded, lower some of these regulations, and come up with a solution. The automated drivers sometimes seems far away, yet I know companies are looking at that as well too, even just, for long haul, right? But we got to do something about it. What we've seen in our industry with our customers with freight, the fuel prices are not helping, especially the price of diesel. And so I can't solve that refinery problem. What the industry has done is that they've recruited a lot of people, including our customers that are big retailers, right? By addressing a new generation, providing great benefits, right? And making them more glamorous. And at the same time, we've seen, I think, a pickup in drivers again, but you can't fix it overnight. To get a CDL, you can't do that, by next week. You could, let alone the hiring part. So at least what we've seen in the truck industry, on our customer side, the amount of availability is increasing. It's not the end of the problem, yet at the same time, it could be cyclical. And I've seen the same thing with sea container stuff. They are investing. They've asked to provide technology for some of this stuff too. Yet at the same time, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to make money, right? So they can overinvest. To your point, you just build ships for Christmas to haul stuff from anywhere in the world, right? They got to make money year round. So there will be a balance, but at least we've seen the industry react very proactively and try to solve the problem.
I think your answer, or your question rather, confirms or elaborates on our forecast that these challenges aren't going away soon, right? And they were, a lot of the challenges you mentioned is something we've been talking about for 10, 15 years, right? And certainly the pandemic was a question of supply and demand, unique circumstances, right? We weren't getting containers fast enough back from east to west. But I think exactly what you hit on is the reason why there is this critical thinking, not only internally in companies, but also at the governmental and international level about what is the future of supply chains, how are they going to operate, how are we going to man them, how are we going to ensure that they continue to flow in normal economic times, but also in times of great challenge.
And I think, again, first of all, I'll tell you, you're talking about here that has a retirement date, eligibility of 1 August. But when it comes to that, I've been on webinars with trucker association representatives, and I think it's going to require a change of mindset. Let's say specifically when it comes to truckers, in the conditions under which they work, and I think that the demands on them have been very great, and the pay is good. I mean, nobody here disputes that trucker pay can be very good, but it's a pretty brutal job. And, what, the average age of a trucker is like 55 or something like that right now. And I'll just stretch to say, I'm guessing that nobody in this room says, I've got a kid, I want them to grow up to be a trucker. And it is a very solid, good job, but we have worked ourselves into a place in the United States where, this is going way off track, I realize, where college degrees and, let's say, white-collar jobs or whatever one aspires to, when there are many good, solid trucking jobs out there that could employ people, but we've also worked into, we're trying to squeeze so much efficiency out of that industry that they can't work under those conditions. And maybe that does push us toward automated trucks and that kind of thing. Pilots, I don't think is the same case internationally because they do very well. Yes?
Good afternoon, Thomas Matthias, Regional Bank Trade. Just wanted to provide some bankers' perspective. I'm sure there's many bankers in the room, but we're advising our clients and students focus more on your trade terms and your shipment terms. So exports is great because what happens is when it comes to your warehouse, and responsibilities on the exporter to get the products to their country. Helps a lot. And then you really want to get closer, as mentioned earlier, to your supplier, to your logistics, and your freight forwarders. We're seeing an uptick in more documentary collections and letters of credit as a tool to mitigate payments because of all the uncertainty with this situation that we're doing right now. So that's just from still a banker, but we're advising our clients to really get to know your credit report, between this calm better, read values of shipment and trade terms, to make it a win-win for both the buyer and seller, understanding there will be delays and issues and complexities that the banking structure cannot mitigate. We cannot mitigate against the guy sending you yellow widgets when you order blue widgets. We can make sure that the payment method is secure and that you and the seller and buyer are all protected. I did have a question as far as with the talked about yesterday, the Make More America initiative, and you talked about diversifying your suppliers. They've been trying to agree to those tariffs, and a lot of companies started to go to the Asian tigers, go to India, some success. I'm just curious to know, what do you guys recommend, or what would you say is the next evolution of supply chain? Is it onshoring, is it nearshoring, or is it something in the middle? I was at a conference in Charlotte last week, and it was talking about deglobalization. Half the room felt it was going to happen, but half felt we're too integrated to make it happen. I'm just curious to hear from you from midterm or long-term perspective as to where are we going, and what is probably the Goldilocks solution, if there's one out there.
So we learned a very brutal lesson as a very small high-tech startup. We make electronics. So our then founder was we go to China. Now the biggest compliment is being cocky, right? However, it came at a big price. However, we weren't right from the beginning. It was a dangerous bet. That was 15 years ago. So we found a local partner that has allowed us to grow even over the last 2 years. But again, that's an ongoing relationship, right? So we realized that the majority of this business should be based on making, electronics in Idaho. We fought for capacity at the beginning, but we also made our path clear to that some local suppliers by saying, hey, right, we're going to be 1% of your business, but we're committed and we're letting you in our business planning. We're going to be 5%. Right now, we are 65% of our business. Why not 100%? Because they don't bet their whole farm on us either, right? If we pick up their business, it would not be healthy for them. What I've seen is in our stuff. So we also have a big software part, right? We're doing a lot of this development here. What I've seen is maybe some deglobalization, right? So before the war with Ukraine, we had a team and we underserved in Russia, meeting their local requirements, data security and membership. We also did set up with a U.S. partner, a partner in China. Yeah, with GDPR in Europe as well too. So do I see some more of that, like local regulations, make it a little bit more challenging? Yeah, yes, of course. Are we going to look closer to our suppliers in Asia? Of course. At the same time, right, I can't live without Asia consumer either. If they're in Vietnam or in China or Japan, right, I can't live without them as well too. So I think it's going to be a mix of, keep your eyes out, don't bet on one horse, don't roll it all into one farm, and just, keep adjusting. That has at least gone us through the last 15 years, through a financial crisis as well as through pandemic so far.
I mean, you hit on that point right, about this inherent friction between buy and make the ability to secure resilient supply chains, right? There's conflict there. I think in the immediate and medium term, I touched on this in my remarks, right? USG and others are going through this assessment, right, of what's critical. So I think it's going to be targeted to begin with. And, we should have tacked on towards industrial policy to our supply chain time. We can't talk one without the other at this point. So I think it's going to be more targeted to certain commodities or sectors, critical rare earth minerals, semiconductors, PPE, pharmaceutical goods. I think there's going to be a focus on that. There'll be a broad assessment. I think they'll come out with many things. And this also kind of starts to bleed into conversations about investment screening, export controls, undertrade and the like. So we can go down that road if anyone really wants to take a quick nap. But I think it's going to be a pretty broad assessment, but then I think they're really going to hone it in. And I think this is not going to be just a USG only exercise. I think it's going to be done in coordination with our allies. I certainly hope that there will be that cooperation, right, because we're strong together, whether whoever that's going to be, it's called business in my assessment. But I think it's going to be targeted to begin with, and I don't know honestly where it goes from there. I don't think it's going to be this macro, Fortress America, single points of failure, right? Because we learned that during the pandemic. That's the last thing that we can have, right? If we only had one one factory in the United States that made the N95s that the U.S. government was going to procure. That's just not going to work if that factory goes down.
Baby food.
Baby food, right? We know this, right? So I think it will be very targeted. It'll be interesting to see the test case with semiconductors, the incentives there. What does that mean for fab? Then also you have the material conversation. But then, you know, who's next, right? What's up on deck? I have a few guesses, but you know, it'll be interesting to see how long that plays out and how wide the aperture is in the support, but also the mandates that are required on some of those critical industries and stuff.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think you know, a lot of great points on that so far. And I know we talked earlier on about how certainly from our members' perspective, retailers are continually looking at that that picture around sourcing and what makes sense, and different answers are right at different times and for different products. But I think to Chris's point, there I think will be certain things that are priority items that will you'll see more incentives around bringing that back to U.S. manufacturing. But I think just looking more broadly and from the retail perspective, it's undeniably impacted tremendously high supply chain costs, and that's really I think driving a lot of the conversation around are there ways that we can kind of looking at bringing things at least closer to home, and how can if more of that movement happens, how does that contribute to the development of those industries in countries closer to home, and that kind of rising tide from an infrastructure perspective and just production capability standpoint and sophistication of the production capabilities in these countries that are closer, and again to the point more culturally and cultural affinity, and a bit closer in terms of just the supply chain impact. Looking at that reluctance to be more looking at just in time and how that's been so much of a challenge.
We have time for one more. Right here, Rudy.
I've got a pretty long one.
Far as least you're
Well, I think it's obvious to all of us that things are not coming back to the way they were. I think there's a significant percentage of the population, the business population, that thinks that things are going to go. If we just kind of wait this out, it'll all go back to normal. And so I don't need to do nothing. I just need to somehow survive for the next 6 months. What can we do, in your opinion, to make people understand it is not going back to the way it was?
I'd like to start off with that one. When we had our board meeting on Wednesday, John Worthington from IBT, I don't know if there are any IBTs in the group out here. There we go. So you can go back and tell John that we mentioned our primary sponsor today, IBT, for all of those of you in the group. We talked about accidental exporters. And I've always used a different phrase. I call them transactional exporters. And they'll do whatever it takes to get something out of the door. And in a lot of cases, a week later they'll yell about what they did because, well, they're going to have problems. And I think that what small and medium enterprises need to do, more than the large ones, because they've already got that in place, is they need to have a programmatic approach toward their exporting in the supply chain sense. I mean, there are all kinds of marketing sales. But too many of these companies will do whatever it takes to get it out the door and not worry about what happens next week. And what does that bring? It brings delays. It brings unhappy customers. It brings huge additional charges when they find out that, somebody mentioned Incoterms here, I think earlier. They realize that, well, they don't know what Incoterms were and they just decided to ship something DDP. And I have this happen all the time. I had a customer once, first shipment to the UK. We were processing a shipment this morning, and I said, so who's paying duty and tax? And they go, oh, I don't know. It was in the morning.
This is, by the way, the only conference that is going to get a laugh out of it. The only conference in this town that's going to get that. I do. That's all.
So we called up the office in Scotland that was buying this stuff. And we said, hey, we just want to make sure that you guys are picking up the duty and tax on this, aren't they? And you could hear the admin talking in the background. And she came back and she goes, yeah. And we're both going like this because that just made our customer $4,000. Yeah. Because somebody that had absolutely no clue just made a decision. Another customer, and I can believe I can have a string of them, semiconductor glass products. There was a difference in the harmonized code between finished glass and unfinished glass. I get a call one afternoon going, we made a mistake because a clerk in Germany was assigning a harmonized code to the semiconductor product $1.2 million in unnecessary duties. It was a very tense day at that company. But again, we were the hero. We did a lot of, after the fact work with customs and got things figured out. But we have in the supply chain people making decisions that are completely unqualified for what they're doing. We are allowing our supply chain decisions to be made by, I'm sorry to say it, but a clerk that you're paying $15 back in the shipping department. When you've got to have a programmatic approach. Okay, I'm biased, I'm a supply chain guy, I teach supply chain, I do it all day long, but it is more important than what a lot of companies, the emphasis that they give the supply chain. So when I say speak with your carriers, your freight forwarders, your brokers, come up with a program, know how you're going to do it, know who takes responsibility, make sure your documentation is correct. All of these things that I hear from small companies all the time getting pushback. Why do I have to do this? I shouldn't have to pay duty and tax. Why is this delayed? It's because they don't have somebody in an informed position making decisions about their supply chain. And I think that that's probably where our small companies are doing themselves the most disservice. When it comes back to IBT, a lot of our stuff is being done online. They are in no way prepared to sell online and ship to their customers.
Don't you need to put a harmonized code on the first invoice?
Yeah.
I think the other thing you might be able to do is that is just finding those contemporary stories, right? Folks who tell what their experience has been. That's going to be way more powerful than anything else, I think. Right? Usually, like the other side of folks telling positive stories of trade, but I think that maybe if folks have done it right or if folks have had a bad experience, they can translate that and really give that personal kind of outlook on.
We all have a little shot in Freud.
Yeah.
Part of it's going back to the way they were, I guess. So maybe that peer-to-peer conversation.
But so my experience from before COVID, so with the same startup, right? We were very tight budget and everything else, so we asked for local money. And all of a sudden, somebody in marketing was created, he said, like this technology innovation, we won runner-up by Wall Street Journal. Guess what? The whole world started calling. Everybody wanted to be our distributor, even better. They wanted to be investors and everything else. So if we had not a plan to focus on certain markets, we would have been lost. You know how to pay off double? We had a shady partner in Peru, and if we had not covered our financial risk, we would have had to close our doors because we hadn't thought through it. So I think part of our role is to be that educator by saying, go on export, do it with a plan. The same with the cybersecurity stuff, which really resonates, right? Have a plan as well to lose. A simple plan that people can poke holes in is still better than no plan at all, because then it's a pure accident, and we know accidents.
If someone starts poking holes, they're thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I apologize, we have gone 9 minutes over. Jonathan has already come in and told me we needed to stop and he left. So thank you for attending the session.
Minimum 4 minutes.